Okay, so I think we're ready to start the next session. So if you could grab your food really quick and shuffle back in, we're going to start the next one, the last session that we have today with Dr. Hotez and Dr. Killian. Okay, I think we're good to go.
Anytime? Okay, great. Hello, everyone.
I'll do the green tea.
I'd like to first start by thanking Dr. Kirsten Matthews and the Rice University Baker Institute of Public Policy for putting on this wonderful day's event. My name is Tom Killian, and I'm the Dean of the Weiss School of Natural Sciences at Rice. And it's my pleasure to introduce a gentleman to my left, Dr. Peter Hotez. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Hotez is an internationally recognized vaccine scientist at Baylor College of Medicine, and he's also a Baker Institute Fellow in Disease and Poverty. He's the Dean of Baylor's National School of Tropical Medicine, a professor of pediatrics, molecular virology, and microbiology. He's also a tireless advocate for vaccines in Texas and across the country and around the world. Lately, he's appeared in many popular venues on radio, TV, podcasts, and in print, talking about vaccines, COVID-19, science misinformation, and infectious diseases. He's an author of several books, including Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, My Journey as a Vaccine Scientist, Pediatrician, and Autism Dad, Forgotten People, Forgotten Disease, and Blue Marble Health. So welcome, Dr. Hotez.
And thank you. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Killian is a physicist who has the unique ability to bring things down to absolute zero, which is something I can't imagine I
have a great lab if you want to come see it.
I absolutely want to.
So this session will be set up as a question and answer. I have this tablet, which includes questions the audience already submitted, and will be updated during this session. So please continue to submit questions. I'm going to start with the first question. For the general public, COVID-19 was really the first time that they started to pay attention to vaccine policy. Can you say a little bit, because I know there are a lot of questions in people's mind, of where you think we are in the trajectory of the pandemic and where you see the variants and the vaccines going?
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, I think it's a good news, not so good news story. So the good news is the number of cases have been coming down from this terrible BA5 wave, and actually right now in Texas we're about 6-7 cases per 100,000, which is about one of the lowest points in the pandemic. So that's all good news, and why we can feel relatively comfortable sitting and eating here and mingling together. The not so good news is the numbers are really going up in Western Europe, in France and Germany now. And historically, when the number around this time of year, when the numbers start going up in Western Europe, guess what? Then within a few weeks to months, then it hits first the northeastern United States and then the southern United States. So I'm worried that we could have yet another wave this coming winter, just like we did with the Alpha wave in the winter of 2021 and Omicron wave in 2022. The difference is we don't quite understand this new wave in Western Europe, because in the past it's always been associated with a brand new variant. Here it looks like it's still more or less same old BA5, so maybe it's behavior change, people getting together for Oktoberfest in Germany. So that's a little odd that it's not, this time around in Western Europe, it's not associated with a new wave. The one exception is the BQ 1.1. I call them one of the Scrabble variants because they all use high-numbered, high-value Scrabble letters like B and Q and X, and that's an unofficial name, just the name I use it. But BQ 1.1 is coming up, and that worries me that maybe what you could see, and I do a regular weekly call with people like Michael Osterholm and Eric Topol and Peggy Hamburg and others, and the worry is maybe what you're seeing now is the current wave in Europe is behavior change, everybody getting together. indoors, and now on top of that, maybe you'll see BQ 1.1. So we'll see how it goes. The good news, right now it's good news. The not so good news is holding my breath for the winter. And the bottom line is get your bivalent booster, because the bivalent booster has the BA.5 component, which more closely resembles things like the Scrabble variants than the original lineage does. So it really does make a difference for you getting this new bivalent variant booster.
Great. So you've done research on vaccines for decades, as well as engage in public policy, but even more so during the pandemic. How has engaging in discussions about vaccine policy changed during the pandemic, or has it?
Well, you know, the big shift in policy is around, in my view, the acceleration of anti-vaccine activism in ways that we may have not previously predicted. When I first came to Houston 12 years ago, it was all about autism, right? And it was phony links between vaccines and autism, and the activism were claims that vaccines cause autism. And that was the reason I wrote the book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, about my daughter. We live in Montrose, and I described Rachel's life in Montrose, and she's now going to be 30 today, so it's her birthday today, so this evening we're going to try to take her out for dinner. So she has autism and intellectual disabilities. And I learned about anti-vaccine activism the hard way, because that book made me kind of public enemy number 1 or 2. They now label me the OG villain, which I had to look up, the original gangster villain. So the Baker Institute has invited the OG villain for one of their in-person events. And the shift was about 7-8 years ago, where it took on, and I think part of it because we were taking some of the wind out of their sails around the phony baloney with autism, it took on more of a political tone around this concept of health freedom, medical freedom. And basically, you can't tell us what to do about our kids. And it really accelerated in Texas. So Texas kind of became the home of health freedom, medical freedom. And this is when it became more of a political movement. It actually started getting PAC money from the Republican Tea Party, Empower Texans, and I know Reka's been dealing with this for a long time now. And that's when you saw a PAC form, right? Texans for Vaccine Choice, and very much linked to the far right. And that's what accelerated during this time of COVID-19. That component of the anti-vaccine movement really took off, and you started to see a very sharp partisan divide in terms of those who were refusing a COVID vaccine. So it started in Texas, but I think expanded nationally, to the point where what you saw during the last half of 2021 during that Delta wave. So after May 1 last year, the Biden administration announced that anyone who wanted to get a COVID vaccine could. And so vaccines were widely available. And yet, in the last half of 2021 alone, my estimate is that 200,000 Americans needlessly lost their lives because they refused a COVID vaccine. And we're starting to, and the problem is that in general, people don't want to talk about the reasons for it, because it means talking about unpleasant things. What's often done is to talk about it as an infodemic or misinformation or disinformation, as though it was some kind of random set of events appearing on the internet. It's not. It's deliberate, it's organized, and it's linked to political power. And this has been documented now by the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Pew Research Center, New York Times, Axios, National Public Radio have all come to the same conclusion that after May 1 last year, overwhelmingly those losing their lives were from refusing COVID vaccines in red states, and the redder the county, the greater the loss of life. Even so much so that David Leonhardt of the New York Times just labels it red COVID. And to me, this has been the toughest thing I've ever had to publicly discuss. And I think it's great that we're doing this at the Baker Institute. And it's uncomfortable because as a physician and physician scientist, all of our training says, hey, you're not really supposed to talk about Republicans and Democrats and liberals or conservatives. We're supposed to be beyond all that, right? But what do you do when the deaths are coming so clearly along a partisan divide? And I say, look, everyone's entitled to their conservative views, even extreme conservative views, but don't adopt this one, right? I mean, this just somehow we have to find a way to uncouple it. And we know why it's happening. It's happening because of the extremist elements in the Republican Party. We're hearing it. So these are not your Jim Baker Republicans. Where are you, Jim Baker? I mean, this is something new and very twisted. We heard it at the CPAC conference. First they're going to take your guns away and your Bibles, and then they're going to vaccinate you. And as ridiculous as that sounds to us, a quarter of the country accepted it. And then you had the representative from Georgia, basically call people like me who want to vaccinate people medical brown shirts. That's the term they use. So a lot of Nazi and paramilitary analogies. Then every night ramped up on Fox News, right? Every night. This is documented by Media Matters. On Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, falsely discrediting the effectiveness of the vaccines or the safety of the vaccines. That's why you had the guy there, right? All revved up. He's deep in the rabbit hole watching Tucker Carlson. I mean, I don't really know this, but I'm guessing watching Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham every night. And this is, and the reason it's important to talk about is because it's not some academic or theoretical discussion. 200,000 Americans needlessly lost their lives in the last half of 2021 because of this crap. And what do we do about it? And the deaths are still continuing. So now after that Delta wave, it's another 50, 60,000 after that. I mean, when you think about the big social and political determinants that we put infrastructure to combat, things like global terrorism or nuclear proliferation or cyber attacks, anti-science, anti-vaccine activism by far is killing more Americans than all that other stuff combined, and yet we don't frame it as such, and nobody wants to go there with me. Even listening to the U.S. Surgeon General, who's a good Surgeon General, I think he's a smart guy, and I'm personally very fond of him, Vivek Murthy. What does he talk about? He talks about the infodemic and says he's going to meet with the leaders of Facebook or whatever they're called, Meta and Twitter, and switching up computer algorithms so things don't go viral. Sure, that's helpful, but it's going to get to about 10-15% of the problem. Mm-hmm. The real problem is this partisan rhetoric and what I call anti-science aggression coming from the far right, and that's what's killing people. And now, in my view, it's not stopping at COVID-19 vaccines. I mean, even if COVID starts to dissipate next year, these organizations are well funded, they've got political powers. It's not going to say, okay, COVID's done, let's fold the tent and go home. They're now going to work now on all childhood vaccinations. Rake, I didn't hear your comments, but I'm guessing you probably talked about what may be in store with the state legislature for next year in the session. That's going to spill over into all childhood vaccinations. And now I've been writing about what we're seeing on the African continent. And we're seeing the same stuff, the same US-style anti-vaccine activism or aggression on the African continent. You see the Fauci memes, you see the quotes from Carlson and those guys. So this is globalizing now, and I'm worried that I'm going to the World Health Organization in a couple of weeks to talk about this with the leadership. I think this has now become a globalized phenomenon. So the question is, how do you walk it back? And I don't have the answer, because this is not the health sector anymore. This is a purely political animal. And the health sector doesn't know what, I don't know what to do. The health sector doesn't know what to do. And I've said this to the White House. I said, this goes beyond Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of the Surgeon General. There are people who may know what to do, but they're not going to come from HHS. They're going to come from Homeland Security or the Commerce Department, the Justice Department. They're going to come from State Department, because there's a component from state actors like Russia that are using this now as a wedge issue to further divide our country and flooding our internet with bots and trolls. And the Biden administration doesn't want to touch it. And exactly why, what I'm hearing, and I don't have the inside baseball, but what I'm kind of piecing together is if the Biden administration were going to take on a big picture issue and cross the aisle, they're not going to mess around with this stuff. They've got, in our view, bigger fish to worry about. So that's why this issue continues to fester.
So as a physician and a scientist, you've taken this on and become quite a target. What might you have to say to young scientists or even students looking to go into areas that might be controversial like this as to how to navigate it and how to think about their career and their role in these kind of debates?
Well, I think part of the problem, and I'm glad you asked that question, is we don't give young scientists the tools to know how to manage this. We don't describe the anti-science ecosystem. We don't describe, how the world has changed accordingly. And we don't really provide, with the exception maybe, with Scott and others here, really training in how to do science communication. And so the consequence of that is a vacuum. And in that vacuum that's what pours in is all the anti-science stuff. And it's not only vaccines, right? It's COVID origins, it's targeting all virology, it's going to spill over into gene editing and to gene therapy. So I think, we have to recognize that we have the culture of science in America and maybe elsewhere has created a vacuum. And that's been going on for decades. When I was getting my MD PhD in New York in the 80s, the message was, well, you don't engage the public or talk to journalists. That was seen as a form of self-promotion or grandstanding. And all those ideas were put in place prior to something called the internet came along. And I think the world has changed, and we haven't kept up. And it goes beyond that. We don't create a culture where young scientists feel comfortable speaking out. I mean, so what's the message they get? What do they hear from their offices of communication? I don't know anything about the Rice Office of Communication, but in general, the message is, hey, you're an academic, you're free to talk about whatever you want, ... but don't screw this up and don't put the institution at risk. Right, so that's fun, right? I mean, who wants to? So if you're out there talking, you're doing it with the sort of Damocles over your head. Oh my God, I don't want to screw this up and get fired or get reprimanded or screw up my promotion. And so you're silent. So we've got to change the culture that basically says not only can you speak out, but if you have the ability and interest, because not everybody wants to do it, you should speak out and actually give you promotion points for it and advancement points for it. I mean, I get evaluated every year like everybody else, and I don't see patients anymore, but what do they ask me about? They ask me about my papers in high-impact journals and my grants. And papers in high-impact journals and my grants, and papers in impact and higher. You get, right? Nowhere on my evaluation form is there anywhere to even talk about the books I've written, single-author books I've written, or going on the cable news channels or local news or writing an op-ed piece or commentary pieces, because the message the university wants to send, and it's very clear, we don't think this is important. Not only do we not think it's important, we think it's probably a bad idea because it could put the institution at risk. So that has to change, and I think Rice, could be the tip of the spear on this, and maybe we can have some further discussions. But I do think the world has to change.
Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of things that were different about the COVID pandemic and the vaccines. It was really a new technology and the rate at which they came out. Can you talk a little bit about how the messenger RNA-based vaccines, how you see, what future you see for them, and whether they change the discussion around vaccines and the rate at which they'll come out?
I think, the mRNA technologies, and by the way, for full disclosure, because I sometimes get criticized for not mentioning this, we have our own recombinant protein vaccine that we've accelerated, developed at Texas Children's and Baylor, which is now in India. It's known as Corbevax, and in Indonesia known as Indovac. So I get it from both sides. I get it from the anti-vaxxers because I'm promoting unquote unsafe mRNA vaccines, so that's about 75% of the internet attacks. But the other 25% is from the pro-vaccine community. Anytime I give the slightest little criticism about mRNA, I'm accused of having a conflict of interest. So I can't win for losing. But just a few things about mRNA. I don't know that COVID-19 was the best test of mRNA vaccines, partly because coronavirus vaccines are about the lowest hanging fruit possible. I mean, basically, you deliver the spike protein or the receptor binding domain of the spike protein to the immune system. You'll get an antibody response, you'll get virus neutralizing antibodies, and some T cell responses. You'll get protection. So, whether or not the mRNA vaccines will also work against more complicated vaccine targets like malaria and things like that is unknown. So everyone's now rushing to the mRNA basket because they think it's such a miracle. It's a very interesting technology. The advantage of it is you can make a piece of mRNA pretty quickly. The disadvantage are multiple. Right now, the lipid nanoparticle that it's in is not very stable. RNA itself is inherently an unstable molecule. So you need that onerous freezer requirement for storage. In time, I think the technology will improve, so you may not need that and may be able to do simple refrigeration. But the other unknown is the boosters are not holding up for as long as I'd like to see. Yeah. The fact now that we have to get a booster every 6 months, that actually took me by surprise. If you were listening to me on the cable news channels, from the very beginning I said it's not 1 and done and 2 and done, I said it's 3 and done. And I was looking pretty good for a couple of years at that, because that looked like it was holding up. So because all the others were saying 2 doses, I said no, because historically, when we vaccinate kids, what do? We give a series of primary immunizations. When you do this with your kids, you wait 6 months to a year, and then you boost, and then you're good for 5 to 10 years after that. So I thought mRNA was going to go by the same playbook. Well, initially it was looking that way. Got a big bump in virus neutralizing antibodies with that booster, 30 to 40-fold rise. I said, this is it. This is looking, see, I told you, not 1 and done, 2 and done, 3 and done. And then the protection started going down again after 4 or 5 months, and not just against infection, against hospitalization. So you continually had to boost. That one is still a head scratcher for me. I don't quite understand it. And whether it's something just very unique to these Omicron subvariants, I don't know. And the problem there, of course, is the Biden administration was not strong in messaging the urgency of boosters from the beginning. For some reason, they clung to this idea that 2 doses was full vaccination, and that was never the case. And so I think that put us behind the 8 ball, and now the percentage of Americans accepting this new bivalent booster, no surprise, people are not rushing to HEB and CVS to get this, right? I mean, if you look, I think so far 11 million Americans have gotten the bivalent booster, which is about 4%. And there's a Kaiser Family Foundation poll that just came out, says about 30% of Americans say they probably will get it at some point. But that's not very good, especially when we know what's coming, how we started out, what's coming down the pike with these new Scrabble variants. So we have a lot of work to do in convincing Americans to get their bivalent booster. And by the way, I had some interesting discussion with the White House, and the other thing that's not happening as much as we'd like, well, a couple of things are not happening. We're not immunizing our kids. We're failing to vaccinate our kids. And the third is not enough seniors are getting Paxlovid. And the thinking is that almost no senior who's gotten Paxlovid has died of COVID, you vaccinated or unvaccinated. So the internists have not gotten the message out. If you're over the age of 60, that you really should get your Paxlovid too.
So Judge Emmett mentioned your role on the governor's task force following the Ebola outbreak. Could you say a few words about that task force and how you think the state should really position itself to react to healthcare crises? Yeah,
I loved serving with Ed on that. He taught me so much, and I was grateful for that. And it's fun seeing how the Texas government works. Before this, I was chair of microbiology at George Washington University, so I got a little bit of inside information about how DC works. Actually, to say I know how DC works, that would be unfair. I mean, that'd be I don't think anybody knows how Washington DC works. But seeing how things work in the State House in Texas and State Capitol, I thought was really interesting. And now I'm continuing in that role with Governor Abbott. I think it's important. I think Texas, and I've written about this, and one of the reasons why we brought our School of Tropical Medicine to Texas is I think it's a vulnerable part of the country. It's vulnerable for several reasons. Because, as I've written about in my last book, Preventing the Next Pandemic, some of these social determinants are the biggest drivers together with climate change. So, if you look at what's fueling the rise of disease, whether it's Ebola or monkeypox or COVID or leishmaniasis or some of these other things, it's things that we don't ordinarily talk about in the biomedical sciences. So it's war, political instability, aggressive urbanization, deforestation, climate change, human migrations, and anti-science. And Texas has some of those things. So Texas probably has more people living in poverty than just about any other state, around 5 million people. And poverty is still, I think, the mother of all determinants for infectious disease. And then aggressive urbanization, which you see in our cities. For the first time, Texas has more people living in urban areas than rural areas. And with that, outstripping urban infrastructure for water and sanitation. I mean, you can just drive to a few miles to the Fifth Ward and you see dilapidated housing, no air conditioning, discarded tires that can breed Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. So it's a poster child for rising infection. And then now this anti-science sentiment. So urbanization, I think, and climate change. And then if you talk to some of the people looking at the climate change modeling, and now, especially for things like arboviruses, viruses transmitted by mosquitoes, dengue, Zika, chikungunya, the Gulf Coast is a highly vulnerable area. So I think the Gulf Coast, including the Gulf Coast of Texas and South Texas, for that confluence of poverty, urbanization, and climate change, that's the trifecta. And that is going to bring back a lot of infectious diseases. So the judge and I were just talking right before this about, maybe we really should make this a more permanent piece of the Texas government, an infectious disease task force, because again, there's a reason why the National School of Tropical Medicine is here, and for all those reasons. And the other interesting thing about these infections is if you don't look for them, you don't find them. Because oftentimes people will come in with a febrile illness or feeling tired and debilitated or maybe having heart palpitations, and nobody thinks about toxoplasmosis and Chagas disease and typhus and dengue. And so the vast majority of these illnesses get undiagnosed. And so we've got to do a lot of training also for healthcare providers, and we're trying to do that as well in the School of Tropical Medicine. But I think the other point here is we have to do better engaging in this very uncomfortable dialogue, not only about Republicans and Democrats, but getting something even tougher, getting the social scientists to talk to the biomedical scientists at the university, right? We are very siloed, and the Texas Medical Center, is amazing. It's allowed us to make vaccines for the world, but like most medical centers, it's siloed and doesn't talk to political scientists and economists and sociologists and earth scientists, and that's what we need. And maybe that could be an important role for Rice, is to kind of bring those people together. Oxford University recently created a pandemic sciences institute with the idea of doing just that, bringing all of those people to have that uncomfortable dialogue with you, because we come from such different cultures. I think maybe that's the big thing we should work on between Rice and the Texas Medical Center, doing something just like that. Because I think Oxford's doing the right thing, because we don't have that discussion, so we're not solving problems as a consequence. We still don't really understand the forces that drove the origins of COVID-19, just as we don't understand the forces that drove Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome that came in 2012 or SARS in 2002. And unfortunately, we've gotten distracted by all the phony baloney gain of function and lab leak stuff, which is just that, phony baloney. But what it means is the outbreak investigation of all of these 3 major coronavirus pandemics remains undone. And you know what that means? We're going to have a 4th one. I mean, this is our 3rd one of the 21st century. SARS and MERS, now COVID-19. You know, Mother Nature is not being coy here. She tells us what she's going to do, and we just don't listen. So every third coronavirus pandemic since the start of the 21st century, we're going to have a 4th in roughly 6-7 years. So get ready for COVID-26 and COVID-32, because we still have not brought the right people together to really solve this, to really understand at a very granular level how these viruses circulate in bats and understand the bat ecology. When it jumps to people, is it through livestock? Is it through some other animal host or directly to people? Is it jumping all the time and just every now and then, this is what I think, every now and then one of them gains critical mass and catches fire? Unknown, and because we don't do that.
Great. You mentioned a little bit about this, but I want to think about it a little bit more. Why do you think that anti-vaccine proponents have gotten so much traction here in Texas, if they're just a minority?
I think they're less of a minority than we think, and I think what's happened is they found politics and politics found them. I think what was happening is the anti-vaccine activists were losing steam on the autism stuff, and they needed a new thing, and I think, and by linking themselves to health freedom, medical freedom, far-right politics, that gave them new energy and clout. And I think it was useful for the far right because they had a ready-made group of adherents in the form of anti-vaccine activists. It was a whole cohort of people that they never had before. And I think it was mutually reinforcing, and it's to no surprise. I mean, if you look at the January 6th insurrection, the first people arrested included prominent anti-vaccine activists, and now you have the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers marching at anti-vaccine rallies, and with it a lot of extremist stuff, a lot of last night I spoke at the Holocaust Museum because there's an enormous amount of, they know I'm Jewish, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism linked to it as well, a lot of Nazi analogies, and very openly expressed, even from people in the House Freedom Caucus in Washington D.C. So this is why it's become so intractable, because it is now part of the American political landscape. And again, you could say, well, Dr. Hotez, you shouldn't talk about politics. But if it's killing when it kills 200,000 Americans, then it spills over into my lane. And so I basically say this is my lane now.
Do you think the current health care...
But I pay the price for it.
Do you think the current health care and pharmaceutical...
Because they say, what do they say? They say the army of patriots is coming to hunt me down. And my first response is, well, right now it's just me and Ann and Rachel and the cat. I mean, it's, you don't need an army of patriots. One patriot should be, 2 patriots, maybe, but an army of patriots, you don't need an army of patriots, but you get, so, and it's unfortunate. I have to have, thank God for HPD, they'll patrol my house when things look bad, and the Texas Medical Center Police, and the Anti-Defamation League has been very helpful because they have lists of people and they can compare these guys, they're pretty brazen. They'll put their real email on the email, and they're not always, but oftentimes. So it's say, hey, do you know this guy? Yeah, we know this guy. It's very overt.
Do you think that the current healthcare and pharmaceutical system has contributed a bit to the fertile ground for an anti-vaccine movement, sort of the high cost and the profit motive that makes it an easy target to criticize?
Yeah, without question. We, the whole point of why we're set up at our Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development is to balance out the ecosystem. It's gone too full tilt. The policymakers are of the opinion only big pharma has the chops to do big things, and we showed no. Here, Research Center at Texas Children's and Baylor's partnered with vaccine producers in low and middle income countries and made vaccines as good as the mRNA vaccines. The problem was, the policymakers won't fund it. We had to raise it privately. I mean, thank God I'm in Texas, because that's what came to our rescue, the private philanthropy. Kleberg Foundation, the MD Anderson Foundation, the Dunn Foundation. Tito's Vodka gave us $1 million. And not that I'm endorsing alcohol consumption, but should you have a cocktail this Friday evening, and should it be a vodka-containing cocktail? You don't want to get the Russian stuff anyway, right? And which is actually kind of a fun story to talk about, because when I go on the cable news channels, CNN, especially CNN, MSNBC, how they portray us, right? I mean, there's a lot of anti-Texan stuff there, and all they want to talk about is the wackadoo and in Austin and elsewhere. And basically I say, look, I came to Texas to up my game scientifically, to become a better scientist, because of this extraordinary Texas Medical Center, where if I hadn't come to Texas, we would have not made those vaccines. And it's a side of Texas that people don't get to hear about enough. We're a tremendous state of innovation and brain power, and we don't, we let all the other crazy stuff dominate the news cycle, and I try to get it out there whenever I can.
Yeah, and it can be very, very frustrating. Our natural impulse as a scientist is, if we put out more information, educate people, it should be fine.
Right.
But it clearly doesn't work. I'm thinking of the database that the CDC and FDA put out about test results and side effects of vaccines, just to try to be more transparent. And that information is just used out of context, and
I think
comes back to hurt us.
I think the two things that we try to do for advocacy in science is try to counter the misinformation by saying, okay, here's where you can go for real information. Mm-hmm. And it does, no question, it makes a difference. And again, targeting the social media companies, switching up computer algorithms, also extremely important, but it doesn't get to 2/3 of the problem, or I don't know what the real number is, 2/3, 3/4, which is, what do you do from these groups that are deliberately targeting people in places like Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi with, saying that your political allegiance is tied to not getting vaccinated, or downplaying the severity of COVID, even if it means the loss of your life or the loss of your loved ones. And that's where we don't go.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the next pandemic, the fourth pandemic. Based on our how we responded to this current one and how our practices have or haven't changed coming out of it, do you think we'll be better prepared for the next one?
Well, I'd like to be optimistic. We have learned some things, but unfortunately, one of the things that we've learned was what I see as an epic fail of the Centers for Disease Control and our state and local health authorities in many places. Less so here. Than I think we did a better job than most places, but both Harris County Health and City Health, Houston City Health. But look at what the CDC missed. They missed the entry of the virus from Southern Europe into New York, right? All eyes were on travel restrictions from China, and the virus came in from Southern Europe, caused that terrible epidemic in New York. The virus was circulating for weeks, and nobody had picked it up, and nobody led an effort to stop it in its tracks there and prevent it from cutting across the nation, causing that terrible wave that first summer in Texas, never getting diagnostic testing up and running, never getting genomic sequencing adequately going, never creating models, predictive models, and relying on the universities like University of Washington and UT Austin and Johns Hopkins and a few others. So just they came up small every time, and so we've got to fix the CDC. I know what some are proposing is to create a pandemic threat center in Washington, D.C., which I say, probably the last thing you want to do, because that's what got us into problems in the first place, having things run out of water. You want to get as far as Washington as you can. I guess Atlanta is as good a place as any, better Houston, but put it, so I think the answer is fixing the CDC, empowering the CDC and putting them out in front. We've got, and together with the state and local health agencies, because I think the other thing the pandemic revealed was the chronic underfunding of state and local health agencies. They're demoralized, they were beat up a lot, and so I think it's not only the CDC, but empowering that. And until we do that, we're definitely not ready for another pandemic. And of course, fixing our health communications, and which, we still, even though the Biden administration is head and shoulders better than the Trump administration on health and science and communication, you still had the president say on 60 Minutes twice that the pandemic was over, when everyone knows that's BS, right? And what's that? And it's not like a mistake, because he said it twice and it was pre-recorded on 60 Minutes. The White House had days to walk it back, and they didn't. So this was deliberate, and so that's more of the same too.
And of course, we're not isolated. These pandemics are global. So are we cooperating enough with global institutions? And are we in the lead, or are other countries doing a better job?
Well, I think no one looks great right now with COVID-19. But we don't, even within the U.S. and our foreign relations, we don't take advantage enough of scientific cooperation. For instance, again, here's where the conflict of interest comes in. The Biden administration put all this energy, too little too late, on purchasing mRNA doses and donating them to African countries and Southeast Asia. And by then, everybody was so pissed off, nobody accepted the vaccines anyway, or barely, and so it was too little too late. What I said to the State Department is, look, what we're doing with India and Indonesia is true science diplomacy. We're working together to make that vaccine. There's nothing more powerful than that. This is what Sabin did with the Soviets at the height of the Cold War to make the polio vaccine. Why isn't this being fostered and promoted more? So now, we did it, but despite no help from the U.S. government, and relying on philanthropy here in Texas. And 75 million doses have now gone into arms of kids in India, of a vaccine made jointly between us and Biological E in India. And now in Indonesia, our group, which is co-headed by myself and Dr. Mary Elena Batazzi, we're doing this to make the first halal vaccine for Muslim majority countries, and that just got made. And again, the U.S. government doesn't want to take ownership of that, even though I think this is where we can really shine. We still science, and I say this to Neil Lane and when Ed was here all the time. I think science diplomacy could be the most powerful component of U.S. foreign policy, and it's the one we least tap and we least explore. So I think the other message for you and the Baker Institute is, let's build that up, because everyone else is leaving it on the table, and yet it is, so powerful. Why do people love this country? Among them, in my time as science envoy in the Obama administration, it's our research institutes and universities, right? That's why they admire us. I'll never forget, when I was science envoy, they had me at one of these diwaniyas. This is where all in Saudi, this is where all the men get together, drink tea and coffee, and discuss events in the evening, and they asked me to speak, and I'll never forget it, because I was doing that when Trump was running, and he was saying terrible things about Muslims earlier in the day, and I was saying, oh crap, now I gotta be at this diwaniyah and now explain what was being said, and sure enough, first question I'm asked about it, and the host sees me start to stumble, and he gets up and he says, oh, Peter, don't worry about it. I know this, quote unquote, I know this is all bullshit. Listen, I did my PhD at Iowa State University. I lived with a family in Ames, Iowa for 5 years. I know what the real America is like. Done, right? So that said to me, who are our greatest ambassadors? It's Rice University, it's University of Texas, it's Texas A&M, and yet we don't really build it out that way. I think we're missing an opportunity.
No, clearly. It's just baffling that the vaccines for COVID should have been our greatest triumph.
Right.
And the rate at which they came out, how many lives they were saving,
Right.
and somehow
We
the
fumbled.
public opinion
We fumbled it.
turned against it. Yeah, very, very sad. There's a question here about asking about informed consent in regards to vaccines, and so I guess this gets to a better question of the changing landscape of the medical freedom, is how strong you think those arguments are going to be, and whether this is going to be a real ongoing challenge going forward to putting up legal roadblocks to good public policy.
Yeah, it's because, when I get my COVID vaccines at HEB or flu vaccines, I do sign something. So there is informed consent. That's not what they're looking for. They're not looking for informed consent. They are looking for you to tell information to parents and to people to scare them into not getting the vaccine. Mm-hmm. That's what this is about. They want a piece of paper with all the phony baloney stuff that you can download from anti-vaccine websites. That's their version of informed consent. So,
So you've really been in this fight for quite a while. Do you foresee that this gap can be bridged, given how contentious it is between anti-vaccine, pro-vaccine?
Well, right now it's tough because now this is so firmly ensconced in anti-science, so firmly ensconced in American politics. I do think there eventually will be an autocorrection. I hope so. I just don't know when. I don't know if we're talking months or years, but I am concerned. And the problem is it's not just targeting the science, it's targeting the scientist. If you listen to the rhetoric of some members of the House Freedom Caucus and Rand Paul and Senator Johnson from Wisconsin, basically portraying us, including me, as enemies of the state. Very much like what Stalin did, during the Great Purge. And then the similar kind of rhetoric that you're hearing from Tucker Carlson. They're basically old-style communists in that sense. And so I do worry about that could have a continued chilling effect. When I get the email that says the Patriots are coming to hunt me down, I said, wait a minute, we're the freaking Patriots, right? We're a nation of science and technology, and we won World War II and defeated fascism in the Cold War, and because of science, and defeating AIDS because of science. That's true patriotism, and somehow we have to flip this on its side to get people. And I think most of the country does accept that. It is a minority, but it's a big minority, and it's a very aggressive minority of people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great place to start on that a good message. I think the future, if we keep working and scientists get out and are willing to be part of the conversation, I think we can make a difference.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you on that.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.